Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, Episode 16. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. You can always access our podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Anthony Ruggiero. Anthony is Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and Senior Director of FDD's Nonproliferation and Biodefense program. Most recently, he served in the capacity of Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and National Security Council Senior Director for Counterproliferation and Biodefense. Before his promotion to Senior Director, he served at the NSC as a Director for North Korea. He also worked at the U.S. Senate, Department of Treasury, and the U.S. Department of State. He's advised multiple levels of both Republican and Democrat administrations on a wide range of topics. Among the many others already mentioned, he's also addressed issues related to the COVID-19 pandemic, investigations into COVID-19 origins, and issues related to proliferation with Iran and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, otherwise known as North Korea. He's also testified before Congress. At the end of the program, we'll point you to Anthony's social media and professional accounts to follow his work. But with that, Anthony, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in. So I mentioned in our pre-program that we want to try to help our audience know a little bit more about our guests and kind of what brought them to the here and now. We joke a little bit about most of us don't grow up anticipating that we're going to work in some kind of an intelligence or counterproliferation program. But would you please give us a short arc of how you went from kind of being a normal American into being one that is an expert in this really important and specialized field?
Well, thank you. Thanks, Steve, and thanks for having me. I was going to go to law school for most of my time, through most of my undergraduate career. I was pre-law, and I had the not innovative, political science major and history minor, which seems like clear path to law school. And then I had an interest peaked in international relations. And law school seemed like a lot of money at the time when I didn't really see myself practicing law in terms of being in a courtroom or other avenues. So then I quickly pivoted and got a degree in international security affairs and found myself at the State Department, just before both the Y2K and 9/11, things that for our generation were important events. And I stayed there for about 13 years at the State Department. I was an intelligence analyst to start off with. And that's really where I learned I started working on the dual issues of nonproliferation and sanctions at the State Department. Then, as you noted, I eventually moved my way to Treasury, which is where most sanctions folks like to go. And then I was on Capitol Hill for a year. And then my first stint at FDD, I was there for a year and a half, working mostly on North Korea. And then I was only supposed to spend a year at the NSC, and I wound up spending 2.5. And now I'm back at FDD since February 2021. But it's been an interesting ride. These issues are changing constantly every day. So it's definitely important stuff that we're working on.
Well, sounds like a fun journey looking into a lot of scary stuff. You obviously the Y2K came and went, thankfully. 9/11 did change everything for a time. I remember at that moment in the White House, we sort of shifted gears into looking at a lot of different illicit activities, whether it's counterproliferation, the financial measures that did lead to looking into financial tools to counter proliferation and terrorism. We're coincident with a surprise announcement by the nice, kind leader of North Korea that when challenged, and we thought he would deny that he had a nuclear program, he said, "Yep, I have one." and we had to completely change policy to start looking in that direction. To the extent you can kind of share a little bit of where the journey went with these different issues. I mean, some of the big name do no gooders in proliferation tend to be North Korea, Iran, you have Syria, and then you've got the bigs, whether they're Russia, China behind them. Were any of these kind of particularly high on the areas you were asked to burrow into?
Yeah, on just those short Y2K stories that I was working on at that point, I started my career on what still is known as the INR Watch, which is
Mm-hmm.
essentially the 24/7 operations center, State Department operations center, and basically I was on duty from 4 to midnight, which was the core time for Y2K, right? From December 31st and the January 1st, and luckily. Either we did everything we needed to do, or it fizzled, or both. But the interesting part of that evening was, I believe it was the night that Vladimir Putin came onto the international stage as well, which was, obviously has implications for today. But in terms of North Korea, I've worked on it since 2001, which, either that's either fortunately or unfortunately. But, the time you're mentioning, when the U.S. discovered that North Korea had a uranium enrichment program, a covert one, early in the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration. The importance there is that the U.S. had concluded a limited nuclear deal in the Clinton administration in 1994, focused mostly on Yongbyon, North Korea's main nuclear facility that was focused on creating the plutonium pathway to a nuclear weapon. I say all these details not to bore some of your listeners, but to point it out that to me, it's eerily similar to what we're dealing with Iran today, right? Today, we're talking about, this administration potentially concluding a limited nuclear deal with Iran, as if we, sort of a freeze for freeze, as if we haven't done that multiple times before with North Korea, and haven't seen the end of that movie. We have, and what it was, fast forward to Bush's second term, when North Korea, conducted its first nuclear test in October 2006. So there are consequences for some of the pathways that we choose.
Yep, just a trip down memory lane of policies and assumptions made and things tried. Actually, I think one of the most important lessons along the way is to actually let's just watch the evidence and see how things have turned out. And boy, wouldn't it be nice if we learned the lessons of things that tried and didn't work, say with North Korea, and let's not try that again somewhere else and expect a different result. But one of the searing things from my point of view, going through that period of the Bush administration and things North Korea in particular, was the role that China was assumed to play and the role that China actually did play. And there were a lot of assumptions at the time. And I don't begrudge too many people too much about assumptions in times of crisis or extreme circumstances. But again, we've got to learn the lessons. I remember back then a lot of our best experts saying, well, it's not in China's interests for North Korea to possess a nuclear weapon. And so the Chinese government, the Communist Party of China, is furious with the North Korean leadership for creating this crisis. I questioned those assumptions at the time. I was in the minority, I felt, going through there, because the diplomatic play was to convene talks. I didn't think it was a mistake to convene talks. I thought it was a mistake to assume that they were going to work. But that's a debate for another day. But I remember very much having that rich conversation about what should we know or learn about China's roles in interactions in something like this. And so, from your experience watching this as an analyst, going through and sort of looking at that model from that period, what are some of the core takeaways about what leaders, whether they're looking at something else like Iran now, or even just looking at China today, should draw about what do we really assume about how China makes its national interests, and what kinds of engagement can we use with China to maybe have a higher probability of the result we seek, or is it the evidence otherwise?
Yeah, there's definitely a trip down memory lane. I mean, you're referencing for those listeners and watchers who are not as aware that in toward the end of the Bush first Bush term, he agreed to what's called the Six Party Talks, right? That were chaired by China and included China, North Korea, the U.S., obviously, but also Russia, South Korea, and Japan. And I actually, in my career, after about 5 years as an intel analyst, I moved to be, into the Nonproliferation Bureau right around when Bob Joseph came in and took over for John Bolton. And one of the first things I did, I didn't even go to my new office. I was on a plane to Beijing for a round of the Six Party Talks as part of the U.S. delegation, and of course the president, President Bush, obviously made this decision, which I would say is at some level not so, probably very similar to what the Clinton administration did, which was it's worth trying to freeze or cap or whatever phrase you want to use North Korea's program with the hopes that in the future we would be able to get more. I think the flaw in that thinking, at least when it comes to North Korea, was that we were playing for what we thought we could achieve versus what was really, I think, in our best national interests. When it comes to China, I agree. The only time I've seen China actually take action against North Korea in this example was in the 2016-2018 timeframe, when the end of the Obama administration, when they realized the error of their 7 years of basically ignoring North Korea, and the first 2 years of the Trump administration, when both of those administrations were willing to go after Chinese banks, Chinese companies, and Chinese individuals. And I think for China and for North Korea to a certain extent, they had been conditioned over those past 20 years or so that American presidents would always back down Republicans and Democrats, right? Because it goes all the way back to the first Bush. And I think with those two presidents, one on his way out and a new one coming in, I think that really showed China that we were serious. And what we saw was that the Chinese had faced a choice. Do they want to have access to the U.S. financial system, or do they really, like North Korea's nuclear weapons program, want to help it? And not surprisingly, I think for those of us on this side of the argument, they chose access to the U.S. financial system.
Yeah, surprise, surprise. Well, I mean, you really point at what I think is one of the core lessons, and I think there are more than one episode where these economic tools proved to be consequential in leading to a changed result. And I think that the only debate after that was, did we ask for the right things in return for threatening or using those measures? In the 2004 through 2006 timeframe, there was Banco Delta Asia and even the Bank of China, in some of its broader umbrella of state-owned banks, were threatened to be listed as potential money laundering concerns. And of course, anyone with brains or eyes to see would know that there are illicit funds that go through those institutions. And so it's really just a question of, are we going to enforce or are we not going to enforce? And at that time, in my estimation, our government basically asked, we want a resumption of talks and we want to arrive at some kind of a framework agreement that would give a little and walk through stages. And as you were describing, get into some kind of a process that might contain breakouts and hopefully grow out of the problem. But what it was very, very clear, even in that early period, that when we started looking at the entities that were tied to China itself, that the leadership of China perked up, and North Korea was made to attend meetings, and agreements were signed. But those agreements didn't really stop the development or the proliferation, separate issue. But that gets to, I think, proof of concept. And you're right, with the echo of that in another period later, in my experience, it's the only set of tools that really has sort of stopped the Communist Party of China in its tracks to say, we're not ready to make this break. And so if we believe the Americans are serious, what can we do? So A, they have to believe we're serious. B, it's probably going to be in that financial tool set, which we're happy to have you on because you've lived in these financial tools. And we've got some other areas of policy where I think reasonable listeners might ask, well, when something is as important as, say, a North Korea nuclear breakout, say, might be like COVID or fentanyl or threatening war over Taiwan or any other thing that might be deemed to be a really high priority to American national interests, shouldn't we be also looking into these areas? And how would we use these tools? But let's instead of asking you to swallow that elephant in one bite, why don't we go from kind of the North Korea experience and talk a little bit about what did you observe in looking into COVID origins and how things unfolded in that exercise, and what is your sense for kind of the tool set that leaders and policymakers think they have, or maybe should think they have, in trying to get to some sense of truth and accountability on that? But what was that fun, magical mystery tour looking into COVID-19?
Well, before I jump into that, I'll just say, on the financial side, when we talk about Chinese banks and using that tool, I've had this debate outside and for many times inside, and my sense is that there are a lot of experts and non-experts that have these conversations, and unfortunately, the debate revolves around really two extremes: the almost do nothing. Maybe you'll send a strongly worded demarche or letter to China, as they did in the case of North Korea sanctions recently, or accusing those of us who want to do something of starting some kind of worldwide contagion in the sense of the financial side. But there's definitely a middle ground. It's been proven there are multiple tools that could be used, have been used in that short period of time I mentioned. But unfortunately, we don't use those, and the Chinese banks know that. The Chinese regulators, the Chinese government knows that. It's part of the reason why I think you see the Chinese doing certain things that, if we actually were using the tools we're supposed to be doing, the ones that are congressionally mandated, that China's behavior would be very different than it is today. In terms of COVID origins, maybe it's best to start with today and go backwards. I guess I would say today, I'm very disappointed by the nature of the COVID origins debate. If you look in newspapers or YouTube or where, not the dark parts of YouTube, but the real reality parts of it, it's all focused on, a single, article, proximal origins, and arguments back and forth amongst scientists. And somehow we've lost the focus that, what about China's hiding of COVID origins? How about we spend less time arguing over like Slack messages and emails that are come out of FOIA and elsewhere, and spend a little bit more time talking about why is it that the Chinese lab that we're so concerned about took their virus database offline in September 2019. When most people now believe in the fall or even into the summer of 2019 is when COVID-19 actually started. And so, that's a critical question. The other critical questions we should be asking is, okay, scientists on the natural transmission, the zoonosis. I mean, I've written about and been very clear that I believe it was a lab origin, but I'm open to, being wrong and switching my view. But maybe we should have a debate over scientists who say, what we have to do is we have to go to caves where the bats are to find viruses that might eventually infect the human population and then bring them back into a lab in a city and do whatever we're doing with them. And then potentially they can get out. Maybe we should be having the debate of, did that research actually cause the pandemic? Should we be continuing that kind of research, or at least should we be funding that kind of research? All of that, unfortunately, has been lost in this, what I feel is a very political and quite unnecessary debate currently on COVID origins.
Well, we also have the not so small issue of why did the government of China feel as if it could act with impunity about letting some flights out of country while shutting down transportation internally, and then pretty obviously shading the truth and engaging in information warfare to divert attention away from what was ultimately its responsibility for all, if at least most, if not all, of the outbreak. I mean, the inattention to quality control and lack of respect for human dignity is kind of part and parcel with the Communist Party and thinking about unlimited population with also unlimited government control. So I agree with you that there's a lot to pick at this without having to get too down in the rabbit hole on dueling emails among professors and experts. There is a part for that, I suppose, but I think there are things beyond a pandemic that are of concern with a structure that feels as though it can act with impunity in unleashing dangerous things into the world that cost trillions of dollars in our economy, cause convulsions that go at the heart of who we are as Americans and our American system. I mean, that to me was kind of a Hiroshima and Nagasaki moment in many ways, and yet we're still sort of kicking each other around instead of trying to figure out what did we get wrong and how do we avoid getting it wrong again. So I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth and echoing and summing that up in that way. But from your point of view, when you look at this and you watch what people did in response, what would kind of be some of your top line recommendations of what would be the rules of the road if we got hit with another sort of odd shock like this? How do we avoid the reaction that was so costly and really to date has let the government of China basically off the hook?
Right, and you're mentioning of the flights and all these other things. I was certainly there. I was in many of the White House task force meetings early on in the pandemic. I chaired the group below that on a near daily basis, responding to some of these issues, and remember those days and times well. I mean, I think for something that certainly we were we had plans for what an outbreak might look like, but in this case it was different than what those plans said, and I think when I look back and think about lessons learned, again, it's one of those that we were reacting to the information we had in our hands, right?
Yeah,
A lot of the scientists and others were very data driven. That's obviously their approach. But at some level, for those of us in the foreign policy field, like, we understand that in a lot of ways you might have 10% of what's really going on, or there are unknowns there that you have to make some of these decisions on. And certainly there was a full debate on what the right approach was. For me, this gets into the what's the policy solution, and I've recommended this. I know others have as well, that we need really a 9/11 style commission. I went back recently and I looked at some of the timelines, right? Like starting from 9/11 to when the commission was created and had its hearings and finished. And again, if you think that, as many of us do, I certainly do, that COVID started in 2019 sometime, whether it was in the summer or the fall, we're coming up on almost 4 years. And that's beyond the timeline for when the 9/11 Commission had issued its final report. Now, obviously, it's a little different because 9/11 was a single event. This was several years, but we certainly need to do better. To me, the fact that the intelligence community keeps putting out reports where it sort of throws its hands up and says, we don't know, that's very concerning. So, again, as we started off on this conversation, putting aside, if others want to go down that road, that's fine. But I think there are core issues here of where did this really come from? What did the scientists what did the scientists tell us, or what did they do? What is China's role? You noted very clearly, if you go back and you look at a lot of the timelines in January, where the current World Health Organization Director General Tedros was in China praising Xi Jinping with quotes that I certainly hope he regrets now. And those were critical times where China is holding back information from us for that information that was useful for both diagnostics and vaccine development. Those are the kinds of things. When it comes to disease outbreak, I also make the point to people that we have to remember that China luckily is the anomaly. Hopefully, there will continue to be the anomaly where they are not forthcoming. There are other disease outbreaks like Ebola and elsewhere where countries are very forthcoming and are interested in U.S. help and other help. We need that to be the norm. That's going to come up now where the pandemic treaty is being debated by the World Health Organization and it's supposed to come up for a vote next May. So all of these issues, as we distract ourselves, I mean, I would say that if you're in China, you have to be, laughing and pretty happy that we're I guess it's either the Spider-Man meme or just sort of pointing at ourselves, just going after ourselves versus really shining a light on the Communist Party that brought this to our shores.
I completely agree on that. I think one of the biggest differences from the 9/11 experience and the COVID-19 experience was everything eventually becomes tainted by politics. But in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, it was overwhelmingly unifying. And it didn't last forever, but it lasted for a time. And I think that allowed for some space for everything from science and intelligence to defense and policy making to fall somewhat into a way forward. Lots to debate about imperfections in decision making in times of crisis. I give grace on that. I'm much more harsh about refusing to learn lessons and adjust than I am about getting everything exactly right in a time of crisis. But there was this afterglow of unity that pushed somewhat down the temptation for partisan politics until the election season. But I mean, that from 2001 to the 2004 election cycle, there was some distance. Whereas with COVID-19, we went immediately into a presidential election cycle. It was front and center in the political warfare of that political season. And China, as a master of political warfare, it's basically the only thing the Communist Party does is engage in political warfare. And so we had international influence and manipulation going on. We had this duel going on in our own country on this. Anything that we can do when we're actually under attack to minimize that instinct and distraction, I think is to the betterment for our country. But I sing the ideal rather than the real at the moment on that front. I want to shift gears a little bit because we're not going to, 45 minutes seems like a long time, but it goes. And these sort of baskets of issues that we're talking into, I actually think there's something that ties them together, and I want to bring it together in the end. But the next basket involves kind of the Communist Party of China, malign influences, that's still in the wheelhouse of financial tools and kind of illicit activities is the cartels and money laundering and fentanyl, which is sort of tied together in the eyes of our media and our government more so in recent months or the last year or so. Some of these interactions have existed for a time, but there seems to be an accelerator that was pushed recently in terms of the CCP being involved in a systematic and significant way in the money laundering part in this hemisphere, and this coalescing with the interests of the cartels. But in your observation of looking at things, whether it's sanctions, other illicit activities, certainly when we were looking at North Korea with a white hot lens, we were looking at everything from contraband cigarettes to counterfeit currencies and everything else. What of that tool set helps inform what we're seeing with these illicit activities that involve the CCP, the cartels, and fentanyl, et cetera, in our own hemisphere these days?
Right. I remember those days as well on North Korea. Spent a lot of time with the Secret Service
Yep.
on the counterfeit currency realm and some of these other areas. As many as you and many of my other colleagues have as well. Yeah, so the fentanyl issue is, I know you had two other guests recently who spoke to this quite eloquently about, the actual mechanics of the money laundering. To me, it was, I testified on, I think it was April on this issue and before Congress, and it was really about, not to prejudge your final segment, tying it all together, but really, what are some of the lessons that we've learned? It really goes back to what I said earlier, which is is there a there that we can do something, or are we restricted by this? Okay, we're gonna send them a strongly worded letter, or we're going to have these crazy people who want to start a global depression, right? And to me, what I said clearly was, we have to incentivize China and the Chinese banks to do something. And when you look through some of these cases that came out in 2020 about these Chinese money launderers that were working on behalf of the cartels, and there's a lot of advantages for the cartels because they can't just simply drive the money south of the border. Part of that is because our restrictions are working, right? Our controls are working, right? That's the positive. The negative is, it really is, people say derisively about sanctions and illicit finance, that it is a game of whack-a-mole, and it is, right? You hit something, you develop the controls, or you highlight something through a press release or typologies or something like that, and then the bad guys adjust, and so if we don't adjust with them, and so in this instance, when you look at some of those cases, we're talking about the biggest banks in the world, biggest Chinese banks in the world. We're talking about Agricultural Bank of China. We're talking about Industrial and Commercial Bank of China and Bank of China, right? So these are, when you look them up, whatever measure you use, those are some of the three biggest banks in the world. So for some people, they viscerally, they react and they say, oh, you can't really do anything about that. But then, to me, as I said in my testimony, I go back to, the 2016 and 2018 time period. I keep going back to that because we don't have a lot of examples of us actually doing something against China's illicit financial activities. And in those instances, because of North Korea, because it was a nuclear program, because we were so focused on it, mostly in the Trump administration, but some at the end of the Obama administration, they used a variety of tools, whether that was subpoenas from the Justice Department side, or actually going after some of these companies, these Chinese companies and individuals, and actually designating, going after, through the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, going after a Chinese bank. And so in this instance, I think we have a circumstance where, potentially tens of millions of dollars are flowing through the Chinese financial system, and they have no incentive to actually start to look at it, because the Chinese government's not going to ask them to do that. So from the U.S. side, if we're really serious about it, which I don't think we are currently, we should be doing more to get them to start looking at those activities.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I think carries over from everything that we've discussed in this arc of a conversation, from North Korea to COVID origins to the fentanyl and money laundering, other kinds of illicit activities. We could add more to the list too. I mean, there's things that touch upon Syria and Iran and other kinds of stuff that probably would be cut from the same cloth. But one question that comes up very often, and I'll put the question to you, is a distinction between the Communist Party leadership and sort of individual bad actors, whether it's companies or organized criminal organizations. The simple question, tricky that it may be, is does the Chinese Communist Party leadership know? What do we think they know? I almost have to giggle when I say it because you know what I think about this. But you've been watching this in each of these baskets of policy areas. What's been your assessment and dominant impression about do they know? Is this going on and it's sort of beyond their knowledge and control, or do they know?
Right. I'm always careful in these instances because I'm not a China expert, even though I've worked on China a lot. You and other China experts, I always defer in terms of what, the mindset. But, I will also say that I don't think you need to be an expert in any of these things. You just have to sort of open your eyes and watch what they do when it's important to them, and they know of these things. This also goes back to the China makes, they like to say that they're a responsible stakeholder, or whatever phrase of the day that we're using, right? That's one of their arguments to countries as to why they should join the China's way of doing things. Well, this is part of being a responsible stakeholder, right? The United States, we're not immune to this. Whenever I see articles about, U.S. company, something from a U.S. company is somewhere, in Ukraine war is the flavor, the thing we're focused on now. It comes up in Iran and elsewhere. To me, yes, I would love if those companies didn't do that, or there wasn't ways to get around, but it's not foolproof. But the thing we do have is that when we realize this and we're made aware of it, or we have that information, we actually actively pursue it, and we either go after the company or we engage with the country that there's a transshipment area. China doesn't do any of that, right? And given the size of their country, they really need to be able to do more. And in terms of going back to the North Korea example, in a lot of these instances, these companies were not hiding what they were doing. And they were acting essentially either as banks or some kind of, person inside of China for North Korea. And we're talking about billions of dollars in transactions. So, I know a lot flows through China and the Chinese financial system, but there's a question of what do they know, and then there's also if they're not actually looking for these things, or they don't have an active program to root out counter proliferation, terrorism, illicit finance, then they're really never going to find it.
Now, I guess the follow-on thought that comes from "Do they know?" Is sort of related because it comes down to sort of, do you really believe that they would do something so harmful to other people on purpose? This is just an accident. This is just something that happens, and people naturally are defensive and will try to cover up their accidents. I think in each of these baskets, I've heard people speak with passion and a degree of authority, saying essentially this. But this is kind of like the fourth or fifth cleanup on aisle 9. How many accidents are there before you start asking, what does it say about this particular government that these kinds of accidents that tend to hurt us and our national interests pretty significantly, what does it say about that kind of government, and how can we really deal with them? So am I reading it too darkly, or do you see some of those echoes? And hey, whether they know or don't know, there sure seems to be something going on here where all these accidents are going one way. They're kind of hurting our interests a lot.
Well, and we haven't even got into the IP theft and many of
Right.
the other issues one of the things I worked on at the NSC was the export controls process, and that's certainly an area where China pops up in similar ways to what we're talking about here. And not to get too partisan, but certainly the reading whatever crystal ball that we want to read, that it seems the administration is moving from the competitive to somewhat of a cooperative relationship with China as much, but I think we've tried that before, and we know what the results are, and the results are not benefits to the American people, the American companies, and others. So it's really, to me, it's really a question of we have tools, and sanctions are only one part of that tool, right? There are many others, but have we done a good enough job of developing a strategy to go after some of these areas where China is, hurting our interests? And I think the answer is no. I think we're starting to think about that when it comes to the Taiwan invasion, but that also is probably a little bit too late if we're not as sophisticated in the use of these tools before we get to the invasion stage. I think we're going to find that they're not going to be as useful if we're sort of afraid of our own shadow when it comes to the Chinese financial system.
Yeah, well, so we sort of hit at did they know, and then did they intend, and we talked about, and so what are we going to do about it? And we have some tools. It's always struck me the cheapest and what should be the least risky way to respond is to tell the truth and shame where shame is due. But basically, we seem to pull punches about this, and then think that there's a theory that that will lead to greater cooperation and minimization of the threat. When what it seems to do is minimize friction to get to the next meeting, in my estimation. But as we kind of wind down in this ultimate punchline of all of this, we know that there's hesitancy about the World War III versus do nothing on the financial measures, and there's got to be some middle ground. What do you think about this idea? But we don't even talk about this in a way that puts them on a defensive and also helps inform our citizenry about who's really doing what, so that they become the foundation for hopefully more tools, less risky tools, but a more sensible position. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I would say for your listeners and your watchers that, just think about, okay, so we're afraid of doing what people claim are going to be World War III on the financial side. I would say let's have an honest debate about that, and think about how to manage that correctly internally within the U.S. and then, of course, with our partners and allies. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we're not even willing to say things publicly that are 100% true, right? In a lot of ways, whether it's the fentanyl, or in a lot of ways where we talk about North Korea sanctions, we don't even spend enough time. I mean, this administration has not even really targeted China and its sanctions evasion for North Korea. That seems like the easiest thing to do tomorrow. And so, all of these things, and then when we talk about origins and the actual, the outbreak, the pandemic response, we seem to be holding ourselves back on the China side. Again, I think it's more that potentially there are people who are still afraid of how the Chinese will react, as opposed to, as we started out this conversation saying, what is our U.S. objective? What is our U.S. interest here? What are we trying to achieve? Let's figure out the pathway to achieve that, as opposed to, okay, well, our adversary wants this. That seems like the path of least resistance. That's, I guess, okay. Let's accept that. And I think too often, whether it's North Korea or China or others, we seemingly choose that least path of least resistance, but it doesn't fully achieve U.S. goals or interests.
Well, Anthony, I want to thank you for engaging in a really thoughtful and wide ranging conversation. Before we come to the conclusion, where can our audience go to follow your good work or your commentary?
Well, primarily on fdd.org, which is Foundation for Defense of Democracy's website. There's a page there. They can see all of my writings, and visuals like this will be up once it's posted. And on Twitter, I'm not as active a Twitter user as I used to be, but I certainly still tweet at NatSec Anthony. Or I guess it's X now, I should say, right? I don't want to get in trouble, but so I'm there. I don't know what it is. Posting on X, whatever it is, I'm doing it less often than I used to.
Well, excellent. Well, to our audience, if you enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing on YouTube or on your preferred podcast platform. Thank you for joining, and thank you to Anthony Ruggiero for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, here your host at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.